Awesome. Hey, everyone. We're really excited here to have Timoni West, who's the director of XR research at Unity, and John Lax, who's the head of AR, VR design at Facebook. Kind of a common thread that kind of ties all this together is Facebook and Unity are making really big investments in AR and VR. If you think about it, Facebook has Oculus under its belt. It's got the distribution of Instagram. There's really a lot of potential there, and Unity is the de facto tool for building these immersive experiences. So I want to start with you, John. Kind of curious how Facebook views AR, VR, and how you kind of structure a design team around something that's kind of so fluid.
Yeah, so in AR and VR, we're working on a whole range of things. Some of them very far out on the timeline. Some of them more accessible, like being able to use filters and face masks. But ultimately, we believe that this technology is going to be great for connecting people together. We talk a lot about social presence, which is having the sense of being with others anywhere, anytime. And so all of our products, really, if you look at them through that lens, you can see the work that we're doing there. The investments we're making are significant because we believe this is a long-term thing that we need to do. We are in the very early stages on a lot of this right now, but we think it's an important for our future. And the other thing too is just that building inside emergent technologies, we're doing things from whole cloth. Where it's not like the mobile world. I think we forget how much we get kind of for free in terms of boilerplates and sticker sheets and standards that have emerged over the last 8 to 10 years. We just don't have that on AR, VR, so it just requires outsized investments in resources until we build up some of that essential infrastructure, both on the technology side and on the design side.
So on that note, where it's so different from mobile UI design, where there's already tools built out, like Sketch, there's libraries. I mean, it's kind of crazy. There's almost like 9 or 10 years of foundation now that's been built for AR, VR, especially coming from tooling with Unity. I mean, it's a whole different world. I'm kind of curious to hear from your perspective how you're thinking about building that foundation and how you're thinking about abstractions.
Sure. Yeah, so my team is focused on basically 2 things. How Unity will be used in the future, what it'll look like in 10 years when we're all wearing AR glasses, or 50 years when we've all got chips embedded in our brains. What does that look like? And then also, what do we need to build today in order to get to that future? In the end, we fundamentally believe that spatial computing is the way that people want to interact with computers, and that staring at little screens and boxes is kind of a blip in the larger interaction between humans and the digital world. So what can we build today on these little devices, on these little boxes, that allows people to think about how they want things to be in the future? So we're doing this by kind of embracing the tooling itself. So we've created extensions for Unity that let you be in VR, editing your scene in VR. And by scene, most of you know Unity, right? I'm guessing. OK, some of you. It's a 3D content engine, Photoshop for 3D, if you like. So we'll get you in VR, in native 3D, so making your 3D creation. But the cool thing is, even if you were making something really simple, like a 2D card game, you could still go into virtual reality and be interacting with it like a 3D object. We really believe there's something to having this tangible 3D expression of what we see now as digital screens. But then also, the reality is, you can't make an entire app using basically a game controller split into 2, which is VR today. So we have to figure out which tools, how we can get people to start thinking about these sort of weird abstract concepts. Like in AR, we have objects that are not real and they're not digital. They're kind of somewhere in between, like a plane. An AR plane is not there in the real world, and it's not there exactly in your game or your experience. It's just kind of a thing that you're looking for. So what's the best UI for that? What do we even call that? So those are the kinds of thinking we're thinking about right now.
Yeah, I was having a discussion before this, and what we were joking about was for world scale AR experiences,
right,
where we have to test them on a computer, and then we have to go run outside and go bring a phone. That we're building this 3D experience that's outside using a 2D screen that's inside.
Isn't that
and
terrible?
That iteration loop is so broken.
Let's fix that.
Um,
That's
I mean,
terrible.
I'm curious, like you probably run into this with designers at Facebook, kind of encountering similar problems. I'm just kind of curious what your process is like for building these interactions and prototyping.
Yeah, so one thing we learned, and it's funny, my counterpart at Google is a friend of mine named John Wiley, and we were having dinner and we were talking about this, and we both came sort of independently to the same conclusion, which was when we first started our efforts in VR and AR, we were like, okay, well, let's go take our really talented designers who are great at building products in the world, and we're going to bring them over, and they're going to like build these new 3D products. And it turns out that that wasn't all that successful. Like the mental models of how designers think and they design, not only the tools, but just the like mental models, was very hard to actually take a 2D designer and suddenly, get them into 3D. And if they learn the tooling, they just didn't think volumetrically, right? They had a harder time doing that. And so like we've actually found, for example, pulling people, some of the last 2 people we hired actually came out of architecture. Right, that's actually like a really good mental model for a designer. And so first of all, it's like, how do you think about designing in these spaces is different than 2D, and there's this jump, over. I made this comment that like most of the design for screens, you can draw a straight line from what we do today back to like print design, going back, really the Swiss designers of the 20s and 30s, but you can even trace it back further. And everything we do sort of has the language of print in it. And when you go into AR and VR, you're really dealing with the language of film and theater, and like is more appropriate. Sure. And
industrial design.
Industrial design. So anything, and architecture. Like these are metaphors and paradigms and design concepts that are different. And so, just the way you think about designing for these things is very different. And then the tools then represent those differences. And so when we try to mimic how we did 2D, okay, we're going to design this thing in Sketch. Right. And then you go to try to use it, and it's just like, wait, we're out now. I'm outside on doing the. And I think what we have with camera-based AR is this sort of like a foot in each world, right? We have a foot in the 2D world, but a foot also in the 3D world, and we haven't quite figured out the tools, the workflows, the expertise. Like it's all still forming in a way.
And that has an extra dimension as well, which is when we went from desktop to mobile. I mean, the mouse cursor just wants to become your finger. Like a lot of the interfaces where like you tap on a thing and something animates. With AR and VR, you have this entire sense of depth of the controller method is completely different. But you're still creating with kind of like a mouse and a keyboard. I'm kind of curious, like you directly worked on an interface where you're building VR inside of VR. And that must have been a really fun project to work on.
Yeah, we actually use Tilt Brush pretty much exclusively for wireframing for that.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean,
Okay.
Yeah, and we use Quill, so our version of Tilt Brush,
Nice.
we're doing that as well.
That's so
Yeah.
funny.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's okay.
It's literally whiteboarding UIs.
Oh yeah, totally. And also just checking, before we got the dev hardware, we used cardboard, like literally cardboard, and just were like, I don't know, looks like it's about the right size. Text has to be this big.
Wow.
Yeah, so I think being in the medium as much as you possibly can, like every button we did for the next round of revision on EXR, we mocked up in Poly first, for example. So it was quick and it was dirty, but it's so much faster to do that in Poly than it is to do it in Maya. Like, unless you've got, a real kick-ass team. Actually, to touch on your point, I love John, by the way, he's awesome.
John Wiley, not me.
John Wiley.
I'm awful.
Oh, right. Other John. One of the most sort of humbling things about going to Unity was realizing, or starting to work in XR specifically, was thinking, like when you come from the mobile and startup background, you're used to doing it all yourself, and there's really a lot of reward in being a polymath who can kind of take it from one end of the stack to the other. That is, I honestly think, almost impossible for making a high-quality product, either in virtual reality or in really immersive wearable augmented reality. You need something much more akin to a game development platform where you have highly specialized people who can do the modeling, who can do the rigging, who can do the animation. And if you luck out, you can maybe hire someone who can do like best 2 of 3. But you're probably not going to get all of them, and if you did, it honestly would be a waste of time and resources on your part. So when you move into 3D, there are films, or there are industries like film that have already established these sorts of team structures, and you should at least consider expanding your team a bit wherever you're the weakest when you move into immersive.
Yeah, we've been moving, I would say, in product design since about 2005, 6 through to now, to have really these like generalist designers who can take things end to end, and we forget how much like tooling we've built for them. It's sort of like going back to my original point. Right now I think that and I'd extend this. This is mainly for VR, but you could extend it into AR or XR type of designing for it. Really like 4 broad disciplines. You have sort of what I call like just the VR AR designer, who would be akin to a games designer in the games industry. So they're kind of thinking about the totality of the experience in the space. You then have like a UI UX person who's really worrying about the interaction models, if there's menu systems, like how do you actually interact with this thing. You then have a prototyper who knows Unity or the game engine really well, because to kind of stand up anything, even not something you're going to ship as code, is you need a level of sophistication there to really do fairly significant prototyping, and then an artist, some sort of, and this could be a range of artists, people, character artists, environment artists. Once again, I think this is for when you have to do fully immersed environments, you just have a lot of pixels to create, and so like. I think like a base team is probably at a minimum like kind of these 4 expertise, and then you may have to scale those depending on what you're building. And that's very different than where we just kind of put one designer with 10 engineers and say, go build an app.
I want to dig into that for a second, because game designers really build systems, right? They build the world and they design how everything works within that system, what the reward feedback loop is. So I'm intrigued that you want an equivalent of that on this team. Do you think that's on a per app basis? To me, that's almost like an OS level responsibility.
Yeah, so I think that, for example, if I'm looking at the Oculus side of it, that is sort of OS level, and then I think on the social VR side, which is our software side, you have kind of an app level. So on both dimensions, I think you need someone who is thinking about those things. So for example, Quill or Spaces, which are 2 pieces of software that we make for VR, you need someone who's sort of thinking about the overall, like, not the aesthetic of it, but just sort of like, what are the metaphors? What is like the totality of it, the holistic thing?
Absolutely.
You want someone who just sort of wakes up thinking about that. And then I think with UI UX people, and I think you can sometimes maybe combine those, that person can maybe have both.
Sure.
But ultimately, if you have very complex interactions, you want someone who's really thinking about, how do I access these menus? How do I access these parts of the system? Does that feel natural? And then working with the games designer, the VR designer to do that.
Especially with Quill, because that was like a development tool that became a real product. I love the story of Quill.
Yeah. So Quill is a painting program, ostensibly, and it's we're using it as well to like quickly visualize, to create quick visualizations of scenes. So the artists they're going in and they are designing in 3D, like not on 2D doing 3D, but actually like in a sort of void and then creating the space.
I've seen this happen firsthand, which is you have more traditional designers coming from 2D who are really excited about AR, really excited about VR. Then they ask the question, like, how can I get involved? How can I learn this? And they go download tools and they realize, whoa, this is like a completely different world. It's really complicated. It's very technical. There's not really a lot of abstractions. I'm sure this happens a lot at Facebook, and from you chatting with companies happens with people that use Unity. How do you draw that line of saying, well, here's a lot of talented 2D designers who bring good product experience and bring kind of that classical design thinking? Do you kind of build on that and educate them to bring them to 3D? Or do you just say, well, let's kind of pair you with people who are more kind of 3D experts?
Yeah, we're having to pair them, and they're deeply outnumbered. So if there's one team I'm thinking of where we have 4 designers who have very deep 3D experience, and then there's one of these product designers who has a deep interest in moving into 3D and brings, I think, some really good systemic thinking and interaction thinking, but doesn't have the hard skills in terms of the tooling, is trying to learn those. But they're like I said, they're outnumbered like 3 to 1. Yeah. I don't know if I would do it 1 to 1. I think that might be tough, but.
Well, then you just end up with someone who's like a technical artist and not really, if you're just going 1 to 1, that's a lot of design to have to try to build out.
Yeah, and what I find too is that if you're a designer and you can't kind of stand something up in Unity, even working with others.
It's not that hard.
No, I didn't, sorry.
No, I didn't
not that hard.
They should be able to do it, come on.
Right. But what they'll end up doing is they start doing a lot of 2D work to try to get their ideas out of their head into some artifact that we can then talk about. And we find then that that process, while sketches are helpful and storyboards are helpful, you have to move past that pretty quickly and start getting something that you can experience and touch and use. And I think that on the AR side, we're seeing similar things, which is, our computer vision people, our core people who are building things like hand tracking, right? So they'll go okay, here, we can now track a hand with this level of resolution. And then they're hand it to us, and okay, now go do something with it. And those designers have to very quickly be able to actually start, okay, well, what could we create with this? What could you use with it? And if you just sketch it, I don't think you actually get that far that quickly.
Yeah.
I think when I was on Timoni's site, I kind of going down the rabbit hole of cool resources on there. I ended up finding this YouTube video. Somebody surfaced the original Macintosh tutorial for using the mouse.
Yeah.
And it was this fun thing where
it's I used to show them in my talks. Yeah. It's
yeah.
like a VHS tape.
Totally. It's hilarious. It's click on this button. Great, you moved the mouse. Click on this button. You're learning how to click. And it made me realize the first time I picked up a VR headset with a 6 degrees of freedom controller with my hands, it's wow, any experience I ship, I now have to educate the user on how to use the input method. Right. I mean, it's so basic.
Can I complain for a second?
Of course.
So most people now use VR at a conference, or a friend brings them to work where they have one, or someone has it in their house, and they'll spend 10 minutes until brush and maybe a few other apps, and they're wow, but I don't understand. What am I doing? And I think a lot of the early research around how people want to use VR has been heavily skewed by a lot of people just ramping up. And that's okay in the short term, but I feel a lot of design decisions that are being made now for VR, kind of back in the early 2000s when we had the whole users don't scroll below the fold, which was a design rule that existed for far too long and didn't reflect the data after a year or two. So I'm hoping that we understand that what you see in the first 5 minutes of someone ramping up on an experience is not what they would want out of the product after an hour or a few hours, and start to make that adjustment over time.
How do you balance that, though? Because that first 5 minutes, that tutorial, that kind of
Mm-hmm.
is what convinces them to spend the next 55 minutes spending in that?
Have you heard of Beat Saber? Just stick them in the funnest thing possible.
I've heard of it, but I haven't used it.
Okay, yeah. So Beat Saber is a super sick VR game. Put them in something fun. It's the same. Look, when I play Street Fighter 10,000, I have to learn 67 different ways of killing the same dude over and over, right? I have to learn all these combos. How do I learn them? By very satisfying, knocking someone's skull out of their head over and over. We teach the most complicated and robust interactions, computer interactions of anything in games, because the reward is so high. I mean, it's kind of a solved problem. Just make something fun enough that people want to learn it, and then once they're done, stick them back in spreadsheets or something.
And
whatever you want them to do.
And to John's point here, right? I mean, this is very different than mobile and desktop design.
Yeah.
Because I mean, if you think about progression with games, there's a tutorial and every level adds new skills. And you're expecting the user to progress. Versus on desktop, it's here's the entirety of Photoshop. Good luck, make a rectangle.
Yeah.
One point I want to make is we're about to enter a really interesting thing in terms of input controls, right? So the mouse has been literally stable as an input device since 1984. Got a second button at one point, but that was about it, right? So we've had this great stability in terms of the input devices that we've had on computing, and then we made a sort of a jump over to touch, which wasn't that. I mean, we still pretty much treat it like a mouse, right? We learned a few new gestures, pinch and zoom, or some swiping, but we type essentially, and we haven't. It's a sustaining innovation or an adjacent innovation, and as we start to move into 6 degrees of freedom, right? We have these, these controllers that are more like game controllers. I think that the input devices are going to continue to evolve at a fairly significant clip. And if you think about that, how you interact or engage in a scene. So right now, if you think about VR, right, we use controllers and we have infrared cameras that sense movement. We will move, those controllers will go away, and now we'll just use our, like, what ultimately we need to be able to do is just use our hands as if we would in some way. And I think though that there's going to be a whole bunch of different input types that we're going to be exploring over the next probably 5 years, which will then mean like how you design for each of those input methods will be very variable. So we're going to go through, I think, until it stabilizes, a lot of change here.
I am looking forward to the peripheral explosion. I love the idea of customizable inputs. I'm super excited for that. Actually, funnily enough, Logitech came out with a 3-button mouse in 1982. It cost like $400. It did not do well. But they're also doing some really innovative hardware around XR input right now, too. So props to Logitech. They're actually leading the charge there.
Yeah. So, but the thing for this audience, I think it's important, is just like there's going to be a lot of change over the next few years. And so you got to kind of, going back to your question, like we're making large investments. And one of the reasons is we're just in a area, we're entering into an era of computing that just doesn't have the patterns and standards, and we're going to have to like create them, which means we're going to have to just do a ton of work to do that. So it's not as easy as just snapping your fingers and it's like there, it works. And even if we do get that, let's say at one point in time, it's going to move. Like it's going to, everything's going to change.
One thing that has been on our mind a lot lately is really robust placement in the real world, having a digital, not only games are easy. Like let's turn this room to Breath of the Wild, and here's Hyrule Castle, and over there is a mountain, and over there is a thing. You can kind of imagine the space, but what if this room is much smaller? What if you're in a bathroom? What if you're like in your bedroom? Like how will this shift? What would you need to do? What do you need to tell, for example, Unity about how you want the objects to be placed? That means that you'll get a consistently good experience over time. That's just for games. I think the real challenge is much bigger for the day-to-day. For example, let's say you're watching Netflix, or we have it on the screen over there. You're watching in your living room, but then you're taking it and you're going to go like clean your dishes, and you want it to end up in front of your sink in your kitchen. So there's 3 things here. First, we have to figure out how to enable developers to make that kind of robust interactivity that happens seamlessly in the first place. Then we have to have OSs that can agree on standards that will allow for this kind of quick movement and placement and basically responsive design for the real world. And then finally, we have to give a lot of the control back to the user themselves, because they need to say, no, not over here, over here. And they will always need to be able to do that with a reality OS or whatever you want to call it.
I was listening to a really good podcast about like 2 years ago, and they asked a question that stuck with me. They asked it from people with a bunch of different fields, and I'm going to pose a question to you too, which is, what idea do you think should be retired for the benefit of your field? So that could be either tooling or kind of design.
That needs to be retired.
Like a concept that you like dogma, or a concept that you think is kind of inhibiting growth or progress or creative thinking.
I mean, this will probably not directly answer your question, but I think that what we're going through right now in terms of AR VR reminds me very much of the mid-90s with the emergence of the web, right? Where we had a bunch of paradigms that we like pulled over, and it turns out they didn't work. We did like what we thought the internet would be good for, like the web would be good for, actually turned out like not to be it. And I feel like we're going through a similar thing in AR VR, which is like we're going through a phase of novelty, right? So like masks are very, they're very popular, and they're great, and they're great ways to express and tell stories essentially to each other. I think that we've pulled over into VR the game world because that was a very logical thing for us to pull over into it. But I'm not sure that that's like what the next 10 years looks like. And I think that all technology goes from like novelty to utility, and it retains parts of both. And I think we're trying to move into that. And so I think that the big thing that I'm not sure I want to retire it, but I want to like make sure that we are understanding that that is sort of a natural thing for us to do, right? We're going to create kind of a bunch of goofy stuff. I don't know how many people here remember like the original website, like the big button that does nothing, where you'd go and you click that button. Like that was like a thing that was really popular in like 1996 or 7. But of course, that would be insane for us to think that that's what's going to sustain, the web going forward. So I think about that, which is not necessarily dogma, but that recognizing that like the initial things that sort of take root are not obviously the things that actually like succeed over the long run. Right.
I think I really am very anti storytelling, and I think that needs to go away because storytelling reduces a wide variety of options to a narrative that, in order to become a good story, means you don't get the full picture. And I think that closes people down to a lot of really interesting potential solutions as a result. If you think that you need to have everything that you think of or sell to others has to be a compelling narrative, and I agree, it's the easiest way to get shit done today, by all means. But I think that means you can't just spitball. It means you can't just throw something out there and maybe have it stick, and it means that you'll likely end up just going down a very specific path that ends up fitting into that narrative. And again, I think if we want to actually build the future that we want or that you might dream of and others might share your dream, you need to be able to have more than just one general story that you stick to and that everyone fits inside. So I'm not sure what a great alternative it is at this stage. Humans are primed to enjoy stories. I get it as a tool, but I would just encourage people to stop acting like storytelling is the key. Please don't refer to yourself as a storyteller in your Twitter bio. Just start thinking about other ways of communicating that allow for people to join in more effectively and not just go along a single narrative.
And kind of the crux, are you saying there that one of the downsides of storytelling is it limits your room for experimentation because you already have an ending?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a story that I want to tell about how we get from here to here, ignoring the fact that in real life, we tell stories because we only exist in a linear state that moves forward in time, but there are many, many other things that are happening in the world at the same time.
What's interesting then, like kind of viewing tooling is you buy into a tool, and as you start creating, that tool becomes your method of thinking.
I know. Yeah, you can tell by like all of the apps that look like Sketch. Like you made that in Sketch. I can tell.
It's funny.
Sketch is great, by the way. So.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked on design tooling, and there's a moment that you hit, which is like a point of maturity when you use your own tool to build that tool.
Oh yeah.
And I don't know, does Unity build similar? Like, do you prototype stuff for Unity inside of Unity?
Yeah, all the time. Yeah. It's funny too because a lot of if you have to decide. I was kind of touching on this earlier with like a plane being neither a digital nor a real object. So what do we call that in the UI and how do we express it? Right now, if you look at a mobile app, you'll see like it'll be like a series of sparkles or a blue thing that's kind of shifting, and that's a plane, and people get that. It looks sort of like a skin on top of the real world. But then what does it look like when it's not attached to anything, and what does it look like if it needs to have the handles changed? And it might not be a plane. It might be a vertical plane. It might be an object. If you have computer vision for specific objects, it might be a volume. So what's the sort of like visual language of that? And then what do we call that? And we know that whatever we call that ends up in code, ends up what people call it in meetings, and ends up being what it is thought of as being, right? Like that's the power of tooling.
Yeah. I think it comes down to this principle that everything is design, including content, engineering choices, because they subtly influence decisions in the future.
I think that's why, I'm sure everybody in this room has been involved in an argument over what to call something before, right? Raise your hand if you've ever been in an argument about what to call something. I think that's because the power of the word itself influences how everyone thinks about in the future.
Yeah. Absolutely. So we only have 1 minute left. Really, thank you all so much for coming. Just kind of curious in this very short window, kind of what's kind of the future for Unity and Facebook, and also how people can find out more information.
I have 30 seconds. Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said in the beginning, I think this is a long road that we're on, and these are like investments we're looking at on like a 10-year. Mark has talked pretty openly about the arc that we see, and we really think that this is a long haul for us and something that we're investing in for the future. I think that there are some things that we're releasing today. We have AR Studio, we have which you can find by searching or find on our developer site. We have things that you can do today in AR. You have things you can do today in VR. But I think that really there's a lot to come, and so we're going to be hard at work over the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, Unity has been used to make so many digital worlds over the, it's a 12-year-old company at this point, and many games that people love. Now movies, animated films are being made with it, and we are heavily invested in ensuring that people can make worlds just as robust in the real world with Unity.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Perfect timing.
I know, that was great.